Okay, welcome to Psych 235 Child Psychology. Today we're starting the chapter on early childhood psychosocial development. So early childhood, it's still ages 2 to 6, and it's psychosocial development, meaning more of the psychological stuff, but also the social environment. So let's get to that. Okay, actually, let's go over the outline first. So this chapter includes information on play and emotional regulation. Okay, and then it goes into parenting styles, punishment, the self, and gender development. The more interesting part will be the part after, with parenting and afterward, and we're not going to get to that today. Okay, so let's just get started and talk about play and then eventually emotional regulation. So let's talk about play. A lot of parents don't really think too much of play, right? Children do play, but play is actually very, very important for children's development. Okay, play is universal, and that means that all children do it. It doesn't matter what country, what culture, all children play. It is very important. It is essential for their development. It's the most universal and the most productive and enjoyable activity that children undertake. So it's mostly what children do. Okay, when they're young, they play. Okay, they love to play, and it's something that you need to give them time to do, and they will do that. No matter what the circumstances, they will try to find a way to play, even if they don't have very much. All children play. Okay, there's two general kinds of play, and then we'll break those up into other forms in a bit. But there's pretend play, where children, will use their imagination, right, to play. And then there's social play, which involves, playing where, it involves other people. Okay, and there's different kinds of social play, of course. Play becomes increasingly complex, okay, and as they get older, and that's due to brain maturation. That's due to the development of the brain. Okay, as the brain develops, their play becomes just more complex. Okay, more social. Okay. And of course, so due to brain maturation, play becoming more complex due to brain maturation, and also because of, more hours of social play, basically they play more, and it becomes more social. Okay, it involves other people more, which means it gets more complicated. Okay, more rules and more give and take, that kind of stuff. The form of play can vary with age and culture. Yes, children who are younger play different than children who are older. Okay, and according to culture as well, although all children play, there are cultural differences. Okay, there are cultures, countries where children don't have very much, and they, could do a lot of outdoor play, where they play things having to do with nature. They may play with sticks and rocks and things like that. I grew up in a country that was a third world, not grew up, but I was born in a country that was a third world country, and I was there until about the age of 6. Yeah, I played outside a lot with rocks and little sticks, and got dirty. Other environments, play might involve more like playing in a playground. Okay, playing at the park or something like that. It varies by culture, and we'll talk more about that. Let's keep going. Playmates. Children have playmates. Who are playmates? Okay, some of you might think, well, I play with my kids, so I'm a playmate. Technically, you're not a playmate. Although parents can play with their kids, playmates are basically people of about the same age as your child, right, and the same social status. So the playmates are considered others that are about the same age and same social status. They probably go to the same school, and live in the neighborhood. And if you live in a middle-class neighborhood, they're probably middle-class too. If you live in a poor neighborhood, they're probably also poor. If you're in a wealthy neighborhood, then wealthy people live there, and they're probably wealthy as well. Same, more or less same age, same social status. That's who their playmates are. Those are the children, other children they play with. Okay, and children want to play with children about their age. Okay, and children who are similar to them. Okay, they want to do this. Okay. It's not enough for them to just play with their parents. Okay. Playmates provide practice in emotional regulation. Okay, so playmates provide them a chance for them to control their emotions and control themselves in general, because in order to get along, they can't just be throwing tantrums all the time. or hitting somebody when they get upset, when they get frustrated. So it provides them a chance to control their emotions, right? So they can get along, regulate their behavior, right? To show empathy, to show that, they care for others, okay? To show that they understand how they feel. We'll talk about what empathy is, right? And social understanding, it allows them to understand others, what other people are thinking, what they're feeling, right? That's very important for their development, okay? For their development of theory of mind, for them to not be so egocentric, for instance. We'll talk about that as well. And playmates are preferred play partners over parents. Children prefer to play with kids their own age, and other children who are like them. Yes, they do love their parents and they can play with their parents, but if you give them an opportunity, give them a choice, they'd rather play with other kids that are like them. Okay, like when you go to the park or you go to the fair or you go somewhere and there's a little sandbox where children are playing with toys and things like that, and they're similar to the age of your child. You might want to play with them, but it's a good idea for you to, let them run off and play there and you watch them. Okay, that's what they want to do. They want to play with other kids. Okay, it's very good for their development. Let's keep going. Now, there's different types of play. Now, this was established way back by Parten in 1932, but different types of play. There is solitary play. Okay, solitary play, when a child plays by him or herself. It's when a child plays alone, basically. They are unaware of any other children playing nearby. They're playing by themselves. They're not paying attention to anybody else or anything else. Okay, they're just playing by themselves. That's more likely to be the case when children are younger. They tend to play more by themselves and kind of ignore whatever else is happening. They are extremely egocentric. Okay, so they don't really care about others or what other people are thinking or doing. They play by themselves. That's solitary play. They can still do that when they're older, but it's more likely to happen when they're younger. Okay, there's onlooker play, when a child watches other children play. So the child isn't really playing, right? Really getting involved, but they're watching other people play. Okay, and that is when, of course, they're a little bit more aware of others and pay a little bit more attention to their surroundings and other children that are nearby. But onlooker play, okay, they might be looking through the fence or something like that. Other children are playing, and they're probably thinking that, I wish I could play with them, but they're in the other yard, right? They're not really here, and I'm not allowed to go there. I don't know those people. That's onlooker play. I wouldn't really consider that play, but they call that onlooker play. Parallel play is when children play with similar toys in similar ways, but not together. So they're playing there together. They may be playing in a little sandbox or something, and they're pushing their little truck around, or, there's two little boys playing there, let's say, right? They're both playing with little cars and stuff like that. But they're not really interacting. They're not really talking, but they're doing similar things. They're both playing with, little cars or trucks, or even dolls if they're girls and stuff like that. But, girls can also play with trucks and cars, but they're not really talking. They're not playing together, but they're in the same place doing the same thing. Associative play is when children interact. They do interact. They observe each other. They notice each other. They share things with each other, but their play is not yet mutual and reciprocal. So they may be, playing, let's say, maybe at the park, and there's probably, it depends on the kind of park, but there's usually some kind of soft cover underneath the swings and the slides and the little towers there. There might be what looks like mulch or sand or something, and maybe they're playing with sand, and they have cups and they're playing with sand. And one of them building a little mound or a little mountain with the sand, and the other one may, provide some more sand for that other kid, but it's just basically sharing. Or maybe that other kid has two cups, and the other kid has none, and he gives them a cup, but they're not really playing together. They're kind of helping each other out a little bit, but they're not really, it's not reciprocal. They're not really playing together. They're sharing things, providing a little aid, but they're not really playing together. Cooperative play is when they play together. Okay, they play together, they create and elaborate a joint activity, or they take turns. So with cooperative play, if they're building a little mountain, then they're playing together. They're building the same little mountain. They're doing the same thing, and they're helping each other out. They're talking. It's different than them just sharing a cup. or providing a little bit more sand or a toy or something like that. They're building something together. They're doing something together. They're doing the same thing, and they're taking turns. They're talking, right? It's not parallel play where they're doing the same thing but ignoring each other, but it's cooperative play. They're playing the same thing, building the same thing, whatever it is, or maybe they're talking and pretending or something like that, but they're doing it together. It's part of the same story, so to speak. So those are the types of play according to Parten. Okay, let's keep going. How is play subverted today? The bad news is that there's a lot of things getting in the way of play today. Children don't play as much as they used to. Some children do, but there's a lot of things getting in the way. We talked about some of those things, where basically in school nowadays, they're emphasizing more academic skills, arithmetic, writing, reading, science, right? And they're basically cutting recess, making it shorter and taking away children's time to play. That's not a good thing. That's the current push toward mastery of academic skills, right? They're reinforcing their academic skills at the expense of play. That's actually not very good. I don't know if I told you guys already or if it comes up later, but taking away time for play actually hurts mastery of academic skills. Children need a break. They need time to socialize and play. And then when you give them that chance, they come back ready to learn. If you just make it pure academics, the whole day, they get tired of it after a while. And after a while, they're not motivated. They don't really want to try. There's also the swift and pervasive rise of electronic media. Too many kids in front of a screen nowadays, okay? Whether it's watching TV or they're on a tablet or on a smartphone or some other device. Even if your child is, say, not old enough to be able to use a tablet, guess what? There are other tablets, okay, that are kind of more like toys and easier to use, where it may not be an iPad or a Kindle or some other thing, whatever other kinds there are, but there are simpler ones that are more like toys, okay, that parents also buy them because they see that you use these things, they want to use them too. And what's happening is they're just spending time in front of a screen, okay? They may be playing something there, but it's taken away from real play when they play with other kids and they learn that cooperation, right? And they're, and using that pretend play and basically cooperative play, right? That is taken away from that, okay? And adults who lean more toward control than freedom, missing some quotation marks there, but adults who are just very controlling and don't want their children to get dirty, right? And that means they don't let their children play that much, right? They need to play in a certain way. No, don't touch that, right? Don't pick up that stick. Don't pick up that rock. Don't play with that sand. You're going to get dirty, right? These adults are taking away opportunities for children to learn. For children to play, yes, and also learn. They learn through play, by the way. Children learn through play, if I haven't mentioned that already. It's very important for their development. They're always learning. Children are always learning, even when they're playing. And like I said, some children are very controlling. They don't want their children to get dirty, or maybe they are a bit suspicious of other people and even other kids and don't want their kids playing with other kids that they may see in the neighborhood because they think that those kids maybe can be a bad influence, or maybe that those kids are somehow different than theirs and they're prejudiced, right? All that is bad, right? Those parents that are just a bit more controlling. And when you control your kids too much, you don't let them be themselves. You don't let them play. You need to let them play, but of course, watch them, keep them safe, make sure they have a safe place to play, okay? Don't just let them run out into the street, okay? Or run out, run away wherever the heck they want to be without you knowing where they are. There's also sociodramatic play. Sociodramatic play is a special kind of play where children basically, they put on a show, basically. They put on some kind of play, some kind of performance, okay? Sociodramatic play enables children to explore and rehearse social roles. So like this little girl here, I guess she's pretending to be some kind of dancer or something like that. Or children can pretend that they're cowboys, or that they're robots, right? That they're aliens. Children play all kinds of things like that. And it usually involves, of course, multiple children, at least two children, right? Playing together, and they are pretending to be something. They're pretending to do something, right? To be exploring a jungle, or to be putting on a show, right? A performance, where they're dancing or they're pretending to be, like mommy and daddy, and that there's kids, right? And there could be like a group of girls are more likely to play those kind of things, playhouse, right? Where you have little girls, right, playing, even though there's two girls there, they might say, okay, I'm the mommy, you're the daddy. And then there's another girl there and say, okay, you're the child, right? And they pretend that they're a family, even though they're all girls. Usually at this time, the girls and boys don't play together that much, okay? But they will put on performances, and they'll have this kind of social dramatic play where they, of course, they can involve like a whole family, and one of them pretends to be the daddy, for instance. So it allows children to explore and rehearse social roles, right? They explore being other people. They pretend to be others, and they basically learn what it's like, to be this or that. It's actually good for them to think about that. It will help them develop their identity later on and develop their self-concept, okay? Also helps them explain ideas and persuade playmates, right? Persuade others, right? No, you're going to be the daddy, but I don't want to be the daddy. I want to be the mommy. No, you're going to be the daddy. I'm going to be the mommy. And it's because of this, this, and this, right? They persuade each other. They explain things, right? Yeah, we need somebody to be the daddy, right? Because the family needs to have a daddy and a mommy, and, and you're going to be the kid, and they explain things to each other, and they persuade each other, right? Or you're going to be the alien and I'm going to be the brave explorer. Why do I get to be the alien? Why can't you be the alien? And they have to talk it out and explain things and persuade each other, convince each other, right? They practice emotional regulation, like I already said, right? They have to control their frustration. Maybe they wanted to be the brave explorer, not the alien, okay? Maybe they don't like that, but they have to control themselves and just, tone down their emotion and kind of get along, and they might find that it's fun, right? To control themselves, their behavior, their emotions, right? They learn to do that. Otherwise, their interactions are not going to go well. Otherwise, they're not going to really end up playing. They're going to end up fighting, okay? Helps them develop their self-concept in a non-threatening context. So like I said, right, the social dramatic play allows them to explore ideas, pretend to be other people, right? And they might learn that they really like dancing, or they really like, pretending to be brave, pretend to be an explorer. It helps them develop their idea of who they are. And later on, who they become might have something to do with that, right? Maybe they can be someone who is, an outdoors person, right? Who is a brave explorer or something like that, but someone who turns out to be someone who loves the outdoors and wants to do something with the outdoors as far as their career or something like that. Whatever it is, it helps them explore things and think about who they are, develop their self-concept. Remember, the self-concept is the idea of who you are, right? It's kind of a self-knowledge, right? But it evolves, it's always changing. Let's keep going. More about social dramatic play. You can see these two boys over here engaging in social dramatic play. That one kid might be pretending that he has a rifle or a bow and arrow or something like that. And then the other kid is there. I don't know what he's doing, but they're pretending, they're playing outside. That's probably in another culture, a poor culture, right? But they'll, they may not have much as far as toys, but whatever it is, they will play. They will find a way to play and pretend that there's something, and rehearse these roles. So social dramatic play builds on pretending. It is a type of pretend play, but it's more elaborate. It's more complex, where they're playing with others, okay? And they're putting on a performance, a show. So pretending, of course, emerges in toddlerhood, when children are toddlers. They already start pretending. When they're playing with their little cars and trucks there and pretending that it's moving, that it's really rolling along a highway, that's pretend play, okay? Or they're pretending that their little doll is kind of, climbing the little volcano or getting into the little car, right? That's also pretend play. That starts in toddlerhood. But by this time, it's more complex. It becomes more social dramatic play, where they're pretending to take on certain roles, pretending to be, cowboys and Indians, or aliens and explorers, or whatever it is, or good guys and bad guys, like these kid over here, whatever it is. So social dramatic play is also characterized by increasing, gender preferences, their own gender preferences. So it is very stereotypical early on, right? You see the boys basically pretending to be things that, that involve bravery, right? Aggression, outdoor stuff, machines and things like that. Whereas girls, you see the kind of social dramatic play where it's more like dramas, right? playing house, playing mommy and daddy, right, and the kids, or pretending to be dancers or performance on some on some Broadway play or something like that. It's very stereotypical early on, right? For boys, it's more things that have to do with danger, with violence, right? Good versus evil, right? Adventure, that kind of stuff. Girls, more domestic scenes, right, where they pretend to be adults. So it's very stereotypical, but all this is also helping them develop their own idea about their own gender. Gender is remember, it refers to whether you're, you consider yourself more male or more female. Okay, and we'll talk about, more about gender identity eventually. Okay, because it comes up more than once. And it'll become more important down the road. Okay, more about sociodramatic play. Sociodramatic play helps advance theory of mind. Remember, theory of mind is when children understand or try to understand what other people are thinking. Okay, when they try to think about somebody else's thinking. So sociodramatic play helps advance theory of mind because they have to consider somebody else's point of view. They have to think about what that other person is thinking, especially when they're playing, and they're playing, good guys and bad guys, and one of them has to hide and try to get away, and you have to think about, okay, where is that person likely to look, and maybe I should be somewhere else, right? So it helps advance theory of mind, right? As children combine imagination, with their peers, right? They imagine things. They imagine where what that one kid might be hiding or where they would hide, things like that, right? It varies by culture and cultural norms. Yeah, the sociodramatic play, like I said, right? In some cultures, they act out more scenes that have to do with violence and aggression, because they see a lot of that in their culture. By the way, just to point out, yes, there are countries that are very war-torn countries and also very poor, and children see a lot of violence around them. They see a lot of guns and things like that, and they'll pretend to be those tough guys, to be those people, right? And they'll play things like that. Where in other cultures, where it's more about technology, right? They might instead play, with things that have, with video games, or they might even play that they're robots or things like that. So culture varies. And even here within the US, some cultures are more rural. Well, they'll pretend more to be like, explorers and things like that, versus those that are maybe in the city and might pretend, might have a sociodramatic play where they're, like I said, where they're more pretending to be robots or futuristic aliens or something like that, or whatever it is, it varies depending on what they see around them and what they're brought up with, right? In a kind of outdoor environment, very rural versus a very, what's the opposite of rural? Out in the city, right? I'm not thinking of that word for some reason. Yeah, all that can vary. Okay, sociodramatic play, of course, is also influenced by screen time. If they spend a lot of time in front of a screen, they're not really going to do that much, okay? They're not really thinking for themselves. They're watching something, and they're not really pretending. The pretending is being done by the screen, okay? And they're guiding some little character. It is kind of like pretending, but not as much, okay? They're not using their brains as much as you think they are, okay? AAP guidelines, I forget what that stands for, the American something, but American Association of Pediatrics, it might stand for that. They recommend that you limit children to about 1 hour of supervised screen time per day. Okay, that's for preschoolers, right? 1 hour, okay, that they can spend in front of a TV or a tablet playing video games, right? But 1 hour total, all screens, that's what they recommend. I know right now that isn't really possible because, a lot of children are doing remote learning, and basically they have to spend, 4 hours in front of a screen that replaces their, time at school. Okay, so, and then of course they need time to play aside from that, and that might also involve a screen. So that really, those guidelines can't really be followed right now. But during normal times, when they're going to school normally, they shouldn't be spending that much time in front of a screen. For children who are older, how much? Well, it depends, maybe a teen, maybe you can give them an extra hour, but In general, it is my opinion that 1 hour is good enough, period. Okay. Children need to spend more time outside playing and doing other things, not just sitting in front of the TV, eating a bag of potato chips, right? And becoming obese and not playing, right? Play also is helpful, of course, for getting exercise. Screen time reduces conversation, reduces the time that children would spend talking to each other, right? And playing, that reduces the time that they would be using their imagination, reduces outdoor play. It reduces exercise, okay? So children need more time to play. You need to, tell them, okay, that's enough screen time for you, right? Stop doing that, right? No more Kindle or no more iPad or whatever it is, no more TV, go outside and play. But of course, you need to watch them because remember, we're still talking ages 2 to 6. They're still vulnerable. They can still get into a lot of trouble and get hurt very easily. Emotional regulation. Okay, so yes, play, like I said, helps children regulate their emotions. But let's talk more specifically about just emotional regulation by themselves, right? So during this time, as children get a little bit older, from ages 2 to 6, right, they learn to regulate their emotions. They learn to inhibit, okay, enhance, direct, and modulate their emotions, okay? So they can inhibit, tone down their emotions, enhance them. Sometimes they basically pretend to be more excited, or they can, pretend to be angry or whatever it is because they're putting on a play or something like that, right? Direct their emotions, right? To use their emotions toward a certain place and a certain person, right? All of these things, right? Their children are regulating their emotions, okay? Modulate also means to basically make them go up and down, but children have to do all these things as they get older, right? And they interact more with others. They need to learn to control their emotions. For 2-year-olds, it's not very easy, right? 2-year-olds can easily flail at another person. Basically, that's when they get upset and they basically reach for you and they try to scratch you and hit you, and they're not really controlling themselves, okay? They're lashing out, basically. And 2-year-olds can also lie down kicking and screaming. They don't really regulate their emotions very well. 4-year-olds can show more control. They have a little bit more control. They will still do those things that the 2-year-old does, but not as often, right? Just to give you an example, when my daughter was 2 years old and I was, feeding her and stuff like that. And, she wanted screen time. She wanted to watch the little screen. And I told her, no more screen time. You need to eat your food. She'd get mad and frustrated, and her little hands would try to reach for my face and she'd try to scratch me. She doesn't do that now. But by the time she was 4 years old, she wasn't really like that. Okay. She'd still get upset and, would have to calm down eventually. But, it wasn't like when she was 2 years of age. Children, when it comes to regulating their emotions, right, they can show two kinds of problems that have to do with regulating emotions, okay? One is externalizing problems, where children lash out, they attack others, right? They show impulsive anger. These are the children that are under control. They can't really control themselves, okay? So they're externalizing, they're acting out. That's what that means, okay? And then there's also internalizing problems, where children turn their emotions inward. They withdraw, they become fearful and sad, and they cry. Those are the ones that are over-controlled, which basically means that, yes, they're still emotional, right? They have, trouble regulating their emotions, but here, rather than lashing out, they withdraw and they run away crying, or they go to their room, right? Those are internalizing problems, okay? That's also not healthy for them to just withdraw. Let's keep going. Neurological and hormonal effects. Because of the brain, right? Hormones, by the way, affect brain development, okay? And boys do have more testosterone than girls in general. So boys tend to be more aggressive, okay? Biologically, just have a greater tendency to be more aggressive. And that will increase, by the way, as they get older. When they enter puberty, okay? There'll be a big difference, okay, in aggressive behavior. But you see it early on as well. Boys are a bit more aggressive. When they have problems regulating their emotions, you'll see more of this externalizing behaviors, where they lash out and they basically hit and scream and throw things and things like that. Whereas with girls, they tend to be more anxious, more fearful when it comes to regulating their emotions, right? They have a tendency to be a bit more over-controlled and cry and get sad and things like that. Okay, not as likely to be as aggressive as boys, but they also have problems, but their problems have to do with withdrawing and getting sad and crying. They're also having trouble regulating their emotions, right? They're crying, they're getting sad, right? Instead of controlling themselves, but instead they're withdrawing. And those are kind of stereotypical. Girls, of course, can also show externalizing problems. They can also be aggressive and lash out, and boys can also get sad and cry, right? They do both, right? But on average, boys are more aggressive. They externalize more, and girls internalize more on average. That doesn't mean that there's a lot of overlap. Doesn't mean that your kid can't be both. They often will show both. Psychopathology is not typical. It's not typical, by the way. It's not normal for your kid to behave this way, right? To lash out and scream and throw things and behave aggressively, or to withdraw and cry and, and basically, withdraw, okay? That is not normal. It's not typical. Children show these tendencies, okay? But they need to learn to regulate their emotions and behave more normally. Children of both sexes usually learn to regulate these emotions, right? As their brains mature and their parents nurture them and teach them and guide them, right? They will learn to behave more appropriately, okay? It's not normal, right? Or acceptable for them to continue to behave that way. You need to correct them. They need to get better at regulating their emotions. When they're young, it's just they're not very socialized, okay? They don't know the proper ways to behave, okay? And they need to learn that. They need to learn to control themselves. Let's keep going. More about emotional regulation. Emotional regulation can be hampered, or basically it can be hurt by neurological damage during development. If, let's say, the mother was stressed, was ill, or a heavy drug user during pregnancy. We talked about things like that during prenatal development. Basically, if the mother's not taking good care of herself and she's using drugs, or if she's under a lot of stress, or she's very sick, that will affect prenatal development and the development of the brain, right? Because of stress hormones and, other things, chemicals like drugs and things like that, teratogens, all these things can hurt the developing embryo, the developing fetus during prenatal development. And that can show up later on basically as difficulty regulating emotions, okay? So also infants that are malnourished, that are injured and frightened, right? So even after they're born, if they're malnourished, they're not given proper nourishment, right? If they're injured, if they're frightened, right, that can increase cortisol. That's basically stressful for children to, right, not have enough to eat, to be injured, right, or go through abuse or be frightened all the time, right? That increases cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which can heighten emotions and lead to overreaction, right? It can lead to a child that's not very well balanced, right? It will affect their behavior. This child can have anger problems or problems with aggression, right? Because they're stressed out, they've experienced a lot of abuse, a lot of pain, basically, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and basically they become this, this basically person who is on edge, and then they show this kind of behavior even at school, right? Because of all this stress hormone. If the child is abused, the children can also withdraw, right? Over time, if the child is abused, or has a very stressful environment over a long period of time, the child can basically cope by withdrawing, by learning to kind of tune things out and not let them affect them so much. So that can lead to decreased cortisol, which can lead to blunting their emotions, where children learn to withdraw instead and avoid things and just withdraw. And that is basically showing signs of depression. They're showing behavior that is like those that are depressed. So either way, a very stressful environment, and an environment that includes abuse, a lot of, injury, or a lot of things that are scary, right, will lead to problems with, problems for children regulating their emotions. Okay, it's not a good thing. You want an environment that's not too chaotic. You want children to feel, you want a stable environment where children feel safe and secure, and they can be themselves. Okay, more about emotional regulation. Here's some important things here. From 3 to 4 years of age, children learn empathy, and they can also learn antipathy. Empathy is what you want your children to learn, okay, more of, and you want them to exercise more. Empathy is when they understand the emotions of another person, right? So they understand how somebody else is feeling. They understand what it would be like for them, to be that person. Okay, what it's like for him or her, what would make them feel better. Okay, So understanding what somebody's going through, that's empathy, okay? This can lead to learning, to children basically learning pro-social behavior, right? Where they learn to help other people, right? To share, to express sympathy, express kindness, okay? That's what you want. You want your children to understand what other children are feeling, right? To try to understand that and basically, learn to help each other, learn to play, learn to share, right? That's what you want. That's empathy. You don't want your child to learn too much antipathy. Antipathy is basically the opposite, where children instead feel anger, distrust, they dislike, they hate other people. It's the opposite of empathy, okay? This can lead to antisocial behavior, right? Where children, will hurt other people, will injure others, right? Will insult others, exclude other people, destroy things that belong to others, right? Will show aggressive behavior. That's antisocial behavior. It's behavior that is basically, bad for others, where they hurt other people. And this comes from feelings of antipathy, from feelings of anger, distrust, dislike, hatred of others. And sadly, a lot of children out there are learning this, and they're learning it from their own parents through observation, right? Where their parents show this kind of behavior. But sometimes that would be indirectly, they're learning it, but parents sometimes directly teach their children this, where parents sometimes could teach their children not to play with those other kids because those kids look different. Those kids are not like us. We don't play with those. We don't trust all of those, or they're from a family of a different political party. And no, we don't like those people. They believe different things. They're not like us, right? Children learn these things and they believe their parents, and they can learn dislike, hatred, and distrust at a very early age. And that's a very bad thing because it can lead to antisocial behavior. Hurting other people, fighting with other people, right? Showing aggressive, right? Excluding, all those things. And we see a lot of that in our society. And trust me, people are actively teaching this to their kids. And it's a very, very bad thing. We're a very divided country. And we start teaching our kids early on these lessons, right? We start telling them what we believe and why they're wrong and we're right and things like that. And you shouldn't be teaching your kids that. You should teach your kids to get along with others, even if they look different, even if they believe different things, right? That's what you need to teach. You need to teach empathy. What's it like to be for them? Why might they think that way? Whatever it is. Not antipathy. That's a very bad thing. But we're actively teaching that. We're not behaving ourselves even as adults, right? We're very divided. We're fighting over stupid things, right? We're fighting just over what we believe and what it is, even though most of us behave the same way most of the time. Children are seeing this and they're learning this bad behavior. We are models for our children and they're seeing this. Speaking of aggression, right? There's different forms of aggression. So I just want to go over some of these definitions with you guys, right? And maybe talk about how that develops during this time, okay? Because children, if they learn antipathy, they're more likely to behave aggressively, to show antisocial behavior, right? And that's very bad. If that continues, right, then you're more likely to have a future criminal on your hands, okay? You don't want to teach your kids that. There's different forms of aggression, okay? There's instrumental aggression. Instrumental aggression is when you hurt someone because you wanted something. Maybe you wanted a toy, you wanted to get their place in line, you want to turn on the swing. So it's not really that you hate them, you dislike them, but they're in your way. You want something and they're in the way. Maybe you want their toy, or maybe you just want them to get out of the way so you can be next in line, or you want them to get out of the way so you can have a turn on the swing. That's instrumental. It's not really emotional. It's not that you dislike the person. They're just in the way. And they may make you, basically hurt them because you want them to get out of the way. This increases from ages 2 to 6, and it actually increases. It involves objects more than people. You want a certain toy or you want a certain thing, and someone is basically keeping you from that. It's normal, but it's more egocentric than antisocial. It has more to do with children basically being self-centered and only being able to think from their own point of view. And it's not really antisocial where it has to do with hate and distrust or anything like that. It's more egocentric. It's more that children are just self-centered. They can't really think from somebody else's point of view. Remember, we talked about that, right? So a child wants to play with a certain toy, so the child will just basically grab it from that other kid's hands, or push the kid and get the kid out of the way, or we'll pull that kid's hair so they'll drop the toy and then they'll get the toy. I've seen that in little kids. I've seen that in 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. That's instrumental aggression. It doesn't mean that they're really bad. They're just selfish, basically, and they don't understand any better. Okay, they can't really think from somebody else's point of view. Reactive aggression is different. That's impulsive retaliation, it says, for a hurt. Okay, intentional or accidental, that can be verbal or physical. So reactive aggression is basically when a child basically feels hurt, and they'll basically hurt somebody back. They might say something mean or do something mean, push someone or hit somebody, right? It could be intentional, where they intentionally do it, right? Or it could be accidental, where they said something and they hurt the other kid, and it's basically mean, whatever it is, or they trip someone. It's reactive aggression. Basically, they're reacting, they're acting out because they're hurt, okay, and they're upset. So this indicates a lack of emotional regulation. They're not really controlling their emotions. They are reacting aggressively, okay? Characteristic of 2-year-olds, right? For 2-year-olds, that's something that they do. When they get upset, frustrated, they act out, right? And they can hurt others, right? But a 5-year-old can usually stop and think before reacting. Okay, a 5-year-old can regulate their emotions a bit better than a 2-year-old. But reactive aggression is when you react, okay? And you basically behave aggressively. So it involves more anger, more frustration, whereas instrumental aggression doesn't really involve anger or frustration. They're just, actually, it could involve frustration, but instrumental aggression is more like they're in your way and you hurt them because of that. Here it's because you are hurt, you feel slighted or whatever it is, and you respond to that by hurting somebody else or saying something mean, something like that. Other forms of aggression, relational aggression. Relational aggression, we're talking about non-physical acts, okay? You do something to hurt somebody's relations. That's relational aggression, right? You insult them, you reject them, right? You don't let them into your little group. You don't let them play with you, right? It's aimed at harming the social connectings of the victim, okay? So you don't hurt them physically, you hurt them socially by saying mean things to them or about them, okay? By not letting them play with you, rejecting them, basically. So you exclude them, okay? Those kind of things. It's relational aggression. So it involves a personal attack, right? And it does directly antisocial. This is antisocial, okay? This is very unhealthy, very bad, right? You are personally attacking someone, excluding that person, hurting that person's relations, right? It can be very hurtful, and it's more common as children become socially aware. As children become socially aware and they become aware of groups and play partners and things like that, they may exclude others. Maybe they can exclude others because, this is we're boys and we don't play with girls, right? Or because you're too young, or we're older, you go play with other kids your age. We're playing something different. You're too little to play with us. Children will exclude each other based on age, based on sex, even based on the way other kids look. And that is more antisocial, right? That is more abnormal and pathological. And they need to be taught not to do that. Okay, it's actually very hurtful. The kids who are excluded are very hurt. Okay, they can cry and can get very upset and can actually psychologically harm those children. And those children, if this continues, if this exclusion continues, right? Those children can basically become, can be psychologically harmed themselves and become abnormal themselves. Both victims and those perpetrating this kind of thing can become abnormal and show psychological problems down the road. It's a very bad thing. You need to teach children not to do that sort of stuff, not to exclude others, right? Not to directly insult somebody else, right? To be mean and say mean things. We have to teach our kids all those things. Bullying is, another type of aggression that's also very bad that we'll talk more about in chapter 13. Bullying is unprovoked, okay? That means that the kid didn't deserve it, okay? The other kid didn't do anything, right? Unprovoked, repeated physical attacks, especially on victims unlikely to defend themselves. So bullying aggression is where there's a bully. They're usually bigger, stronger, and they pick on somebody else. And they may physically attack them and beat them, or even say mean things to them. And that other kid doesn't deserve that. It's unprovoked. The other kid has done nothing to deserve that. They never deserve it, by the way, even if they do something. But it's not like the kid has been mean to the bully. The bully is just picking on someone. Okay, picking on someone they consider to be weak and someone who they think is not really going to defend themselves. An easy target, so to speak. That's bullying aggression. Bullies, both bullies and victims, show sign of poor emotional regulation. The bullies aren't able to control their emotions very well, and they pick on others. They lash out on at others, right? And the victims also show poor emotional regulation because they're being picked on, and they're being hurt all the time, and they're being made to feel frustrated and angry. And with more of that, they become less able to control their emotions, because they're practicing those negative emotions, so to speak. They're showing those over and over again. Adults should intervene as before the school years. When you see this kind of behavior in your children, you need to intervene and put a stop to it right away. And not enough adults do that. Not enough parents do that. A lot of them just let it happen, even though they see their kids playing and they see that their kid is bullying some other kid and pushing them and basically picking on them, and they let it go because their kid is the one who's doing the bullying. Oh, they're just being kids. It's okay. Kids need to learn these lessons anyway, that you need to be strong and stand up for yourself. Like, no, bullshit, okay? Go correct your damn kid, okay? It's not a good thing, okay? They're hurting other kids, and both the bullies and the victims are gonna have problems if you don't correct them, if you don't put a stop to this. We'll talk more about that during chapter 13, but parents often take a back seat to this. They just let it happen, and that's very bad parenting, just so you know. Just because your kid is the strong one, the one who's picking on the other kids, doesn't mean it's a good thing. You need to put a stop to it. Don't let your kid be a bully, okay? Socialization. Okay, socialization is the part that will get us into talking about parenting styles and stuff like that. So we will actually talk about that later. That will be the next lecture. So we're going to take 2 lectures to finish this chapter. So I'll go ahead and stop that and stop this this recording. Okay, so we can talk about this.